Welcome everyone to the OPC's book night with Peter Goodman to discuss his book, Davos Man. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the OPC. And our moderator tonight is the OPC President, Paula Dwyer, who is a Senior Editor at Bloomberg. So I will now turn it over to Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight. And thank you, Peter Goodman, for agreeing to be with us. Peter has had a colorful and exciting career as a globe-trotting correspondent. In the great tradition of many OPC members, he started out after college as a freelancer. He was with the Japan Times and other papers. He reported from places like Manila and Jakarta and Cambodia, and proudly relays an anecdote about getting kicked out of East Timor in 1992. So he obviously raised as much dust and got on the wrong side of as many officials as he could, also in the proud tradition of OPC members. But he wanted a full-time gig with some media company to backstop him. So in 1997, he went to the Washington Post, and he served 5 years for the Post in Shanghai. And then he, in 2007, he went to the New York Times, where he was a national economic reporter, just in time to write about the Great Recession. And then he decided to go to a digital upstart, International Business Times, where he was global editor-in-chief for a few years. And I skipped that he worked for the Huffington Post for a few years in between there, overseeing business and technology coverage. And then back to the New York Times, where he is today. He was in London until very recently. He's just moved back to New York, and he's their global economic correspondent. So welcome, Peter. Davos Man was coined by a political scientist named Sam Huntington. And he used it to refer to a class of wealthy attendees of the World Economic Forum, which everybody knows is that annual conclave to the Swiss Alps with CEOs and NGOs and heads of state. And anybody who wants to be known as anybody goes, as well as many journalists. But he uses Davos Man as a metaphor to describe the people who were enriched by globalization and people who are effectively stateless, who have interests and wealth that flow across borders, estates and yachts sprinkled across continents, arsenals of lobbyists and accountants straddling jurisdictions, eliminating loyalty to any particular nation. So it's not so subtle. It's not a complimentary description. It's really quite derisive, in fact. And he blames him, Davos Man they're all men. I guess women haven't been in power long enough that they're included in his book, but I suppose soon there will be some Davos women. But he blames him for wealth inequality, national deficits, the lack of government resources to deal with social problems, as well as many of the deaths caused by COVID, the rise of right-wing populist movements worldwide, and threats to get democratic governance. So these are some pretty sweeping conclusions. So Peter, let's dive in. I'd like to know what inspired you to write this book.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks to you, Paula, for doing this, and thanks, Patty, for arranging this. As a former OPC board member, it's a real thrill to be doing this event. What inspired me to write this book? I was living in London, as you noted, and was spending a lot of time writing about Brexit, writing about Trump's trade war and the permutations globally, and about the rise of extreme right-wing movements across Europe and around the globe, from Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and closer to my home then, Salvini and other parts of the extreme right in Italy, even Sweden, this bastion of social democracy, where the Sweden Democrats, while I was there, emerged from the wilderness, this party forged in the neo-Nazi movement to become a mainstream political party. And in each of these instances, the kind of conventional wisdom explanation of what was going on was a backlash to something that had happened recently. It was, immigration. I mean, Trump was coming in not just as a backlash to immigration, but as a rebuke to China. The backlash to immigration was certainly part of what was animating Brexit, which was this nativist response to all sorts of changes in Britain. Ditto Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, and so on. And the pattern that seemed very clear to me as I dug not even that deeply into each one of these cases was that there were longer term forces that had happened so steadily but gradually that they were almost invisible, that in every case were really crucial. And that was the subject of my book, which is the systematic bottom up transfer of wealth, from all of us to a handful of billionaires who can employ lobbyists and tax accountants and compliant think tank researchers, and can cultivate access journalists to insinuate into our political discourse this idea that when we organize our economies around returning wealth to people who already have most of it, we'll all somehow magically benefit, something that has in reality happened 0 times. And the result of this was to weaken governments, to diminish healthcare, education, assistance for housing, public infrastructure. And then the last straw typically was usually influx of immigrants who some opportunistic political apparatchik could then point to as the problem for a very superficial problem for very real problems. And this was the template we'd seen again and again. And I was already starting to put together this book when the pandemic happens. And for a moment, I felt like, one of these people who had a Cold War history all ready to go as the Berlin Wall comes down. And I set it aside for a couple of weeks until I, quickly realized that my thesis was in fact being strengthened, and the role of inequality, the consequences of so few people monopolizing the bounty of global capitalism, that was being exposed and in fact intensified by the pandemic. And so then I felt like it was kind of an emergency to write the book.
So I should have said at the outset that if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. And as we go along, I will ask them. Feel free, but I'll save some of them until the end, and I'll sprinkle them in as well. So Peter, you use some people who are very familiar to me as a business and economic journalist, people like Jamie Dimon, Mark Benioff, Larry Fink, Steve Schwarzman, Bezos, as your primary examples of Davos Man, your metaphorical Davos Man. I wonder if what you think about the idea that you're basically making them scapegoats, that they obviously benefited quite well from the system in which they operate. Some of them, like Bezos, really had nothing to do with things like Ronald Reagan tax cuts or a lot of the things that happened during the Great Recession, the bailouts and the bank collapses and so forth. Mark Benioff is a fairly new person on the scene. And Jamie Dimon runs, a large bank that isn't really seen as one of the primary instigators of the financial crisis. In fact, he kind of helped out the Treasury by buying some of the failing banks. And
that's what he says.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you say to this idea that you're using them as scapegoats and that they're not really the cause of all these things? They just happen to be able to work within the system in which we all have to work within.
Well, I love that question because I think that's flatly wrong, but I also think it's emblematic of how we tend to attack stories in our journalism. We tend to speak in this kind of passive voice. and ascribe belief, as if we're, always having policy disagreements and reasonable, we somehow have different camps on the question of tax cuts for wealthy people. Like it's a perfectly reasonable proposition to argue, as Jamie Dimon did when he was running the Business Roundtable, an organization that was a leading architect of the Trump tax cuts that were worth about $1.5 trillion, with most of the benefits landing just, I guess, accidentally into the pockets of people like Jamie Dimon and Mark Benioff and Steve Schwarzman and Jeff Bezos. The whole point of my book is to argue that what we've experienced over the last half century is not by accident. It's not some sort of puppeteer conspiracy. And it would be ridiculous to say that all of our problems are the result of these 5 people or even the thousands of billionaires around the world. But the sort of dark matter in the equation by which huge numbers of middle-class people have lost their economic security, not just in the United States, but in most major developed economies, is inequality. And, to argue that Bezos was just some sort of, lucky beneficiary of his times. I mean, this is a company that employs 100+ lobbyists in Washington, D.C. This is a company that has lobbied for years against paid sick leave. And then somehow in the first wave of the pandemic, you have huge numbers of warehouse workers laboring in Amazon facilities who Bezos calls essential workers. They don't have any protective care, though Amazon seems to be able to give them protective care that they can put into boxes to send to other people who are paying for it. And when some of those workers protest and say, well, hold on, we'd like to know a little more about the extent of COVID and why we don't have any protection. And by the way, we're all the managers who used to work in the facilities, but are now somehow just off having Zoom meetings. The leader of the protest movement at a big warehouse in Staten Island is fired and accused of violating quarantine, which is really ironic given that he wants everyone to be quarantined. I use Bezos as an example of a great beneficiary of globalization, which has been hugely beneficial to the American economy writ large. But he, as part of the billionaire class, has applied lobbying muscle to making sure that he and his people capture most of the bounty, while not enough flows to the people who work for him. And then, of course, the punchline is he flies himself off into space in the middle of the pandemic to the tune of $5.5 billion and actually thanks his warehouse workers. It's not just that Jeff Bezos is doing really well while his warehouse workers are not doing so well. It's that Jeff Bezos is doing really well because his warehouse workers are not doing well. His whole model is predicated under the assumption that there will be huge numbers of people desperate enough for a job that they will work in unsafe conditions, and given the choice between their own health and their paychecks, they'll choose their paychecks every time. I mean, Jamie Dimon, just sort of accidentally becomes the head of America's largest bank, which accidentally takes control of failing banks and ends up 10 years after the great financial crisis with just a monumental share of American banking assets, double pre-crisis. Now, I mean, is this just lucky happenstance? I mean, we've had a system where the billionaires have functioned as their own social network. I mean, we know that people like Larry Fink, who's the world's largest asset manager, who now is the founder of BlackRock. He's another one of my 5 primary characters, who controls $10 trillion of assets around the globe. He had extraordinary access to Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary in the George W. Bush administration at the time that the great financial crisis rescues were being crafted. And he had even greater access to the Trump administration and Mnuchin during the time of the pandemic rescues that time and again are focused on bailing out the asset class. And it's not an accident that the asset class gets bailed out above and beyond anybody else. Now, we've broken from that pattern to a degree in the most recent pandemic bailouts, especially under Biden. But I just pushed back, heartily against this idea that, yeah, these guys were just standing there and somehow all this money fell into their pocket. I mean, Benioff, who is the most complex of my 5 characters, his philanthropy is pretty extensive. He's organized his company around contributing 1% of revenues and 1% of employee time to philanthropic endeavors. He does seem to take stands on issues like, when the state of Indiana threatens a law that's going to discriminate against LGBTQ employees, he threatens to pull investment out. He takes on Twitter and Google over data. But this is a guy who not once, but twice has managed to pay the modest sum of zero in federal taxes on billions of dollars in revenue. Again, he didn't create that system, you could argue. He inherited it from the Clinton administration, which made it possible to stick your intellectual property in Ireland and then make your revenues in the US turn into losses. But he exploited it, and he's a member of the Business Roundtable himself and the US Chamber of Commerce. These are the lobby shops that are serving their constituents, and those constituents are the billionaires.
Yeah, so now that brings me to my next question, which you described Mark Benioff as a, somewhat benevolent CEO who has, at least on the surface, take some positions in which he seems to care about his stakeholders, and there is this concept called stakeholder capitalism.
Right.
Explain what that is.
Well, stakeholder capitalism is this term that goes back to the 70s. It was first trotted out by Klaus Schwab, who's the founder of the World Economic Forum. And it essentially meant, instead of just engaging in Milton Friedman-like maximizing of shareholder value and assuming that all good would flow from that, let's cater to stakeholders. Let's have there be partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. Who could object to that? That's all perfectly reasonable. Well, in recent years, it's become the go-to move for Davos Man in trying to preemptively fend off things like progressive taxation and regulation. So Benioff and Larry Fink have been the loudest on stakeholder capitalism, but it was under Jamie Dimon when he was running the Business Roundtable in the summer of 2019. They trotted out this new statement of a purpose of a corporation and explicitly said, Milton Friedman is the past. Now we're focused on catering to stakeholders like labor, local communities, the environment.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that?
Well, nothing's wrong with that if it were real. I mean, Mark Benioff went on Jim Cramer's show, Mad TV, and or whatever that show is called, and said, well, Jim, the planet is a stakeholder. Well, that's very comforting to those of us who live on the planet. Look, we've had a test of these principles. 181 CEOs signed this statement of a purpose of a corporation. Precisely one of them actually went and got board approval that we know of. That's Jamie Dimon himself. How real could this be if these CEOs don't bother to go to their boards to get approval? Moreover, a bunch of independent studies have been done showing that the companies that signed that pledge have actually performed worse on a bunch of metrics around workplace safety, policies for work-life balance, compensation for people who are sick, et cetera. They've performed worse than the companies that didn't sign the pledge at all. And guess who signed the pledge? Jeff Bezos signed the pledge. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, signed the pledge. Pfizer then takes COVID vaccines that are created on the back of publicly financed research, sells them to the highest bidder around the world, makes a token show of taking a couple million doses to distribute to the rest of the planet through COVAX, this stakeholder capitalism, like a bit of photo op philanthropy. And the result is, if you live in a country whose government can pay whatever Pfizer wants for vaccines, you get protection. And meanwhile, we got doctors in South Asia and parts of Africa who are treating COVID patients with no protection whatsoever. And not only is that a humanitarian catastrophe, I mean, we should be outraged about that. This is our money that paid for a lot of this research. For selfish reasons, those of us in wealthy countries are effectively subsidizing Albert Bourla and his shareholders through a pandemic that has gone on longer. I mean, the result of unequal vaccine distribution, I was writing this, 18 months ago, along with a lot of other people. We invited variants. This is how we got Delta and Omicron. We didn't protect the rest of the world. We protected ourselves in the wealthy world. And so now, even in places like New York City and Los Angeles and London, we are effectively subsidizing monopoly profits for people like Albert Bourla, despite his signing of this pledge of stakeholder capitalism, through the perpetuation of the pandemic, the disruption of our kids' education, if we're parents dealing with kids stuck at home on distance learning, fear, threats to livelihood. I mean, we've had a test of stakeholder capitalism, and it's an abject failure. And moreover, it still has currency for PR value. It is Davos Man saying, I've got this. You don't have to regulate me. You don't have to tax me, so government can take care of the problems that I actually never will take care of. We need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we can outsource our problems to billionaires.
So one of our members, Bill Holstein, asks, the billionaires did well by promoting globalization. Is globalization now breaking down in view of the Russia, Ukraine, China dynamic? If so, what impact might that have on Davos Man?
Yeah, that's a great, big, not totally answerable question. There's no question that the global economy is changing, right? I mean, before the pandemic, we had the Trump-led trade war, which was prompting lots of multinational companies to look for places to move production beyond China. There was already, even before that, a lot of companies were looking at places like Vietnam because it was cheaper. They were getting tax benefits. There were differentials in wages. China was starting to get expensive. That's all sped up pretty dramatically. I mean, we've now lived through a time where even ordinary people are aware that you can have a pandemic, and in the richest, most powerful country on earth, frontline medical workers are not going to have gowns and masks because, it turns out 90+% of that stuff is made in a single country that we decided to have a trade war with. That doesn't seem like a very good way to run your business. Moreover, huge numbers of basic chemicals that go into pharmaceuticals made in India at a time when India and China don't have good relations. And now, of course, we're living through this supply chain disruption, which has caused us all to quite rightfully look at this assumption that has ruled the global economy that, seamless shipping could just be taken for granted. So you got to think there's going to be some localization. There's going to be a change to our supply chain in the margins. But personally, I'm skeptical that there will be the kind of transformation that many people are talking about, because shareholder interest is still going to determine, the shareholder has managed to cater to consumer interest, and consumers want low prices. And that's a pretty powerful combination. And what typically tends to happen, I mean, if you look just at the supply chain, there were similar conversations after Fukushima, which wiped out a lot of chip making capacity in Japan. We had floods in Thailand around the same time, and we learned that lots of computer hard drives were made there, and there were shortages of goods. I remember writing a story back in the late 90s about chip making being centered at that point to a much lesser degree in Taiwan, and there was a big earthquake. Each time we just get back to normal because it's good for the shareholder. But definitely Davos Man is taking note of the changed environment in which we live.
So I guess I want to ask a big question, overarching question about whether you think, we know you think that Davos Man has caused huge amount of wealth inequality. It made COVID worse than it needed to be. And it brought on the Donald Trump and these right-wing populist movements in other countries. Do you think that Davos Man is that venal and mendacious, or do you just think they're just not willing to try to change the status quo when they see that the status quo is harmful?
I wouldn't say venal and mendacious as a rule. Look, I know some of these guys. They're nice to their children. They can be fun to have a beer with. I mean, this book isn't about demonizing these particular individuals or billionaires or corporate CEOs. I think we can all be grateful that Jeff Bezos, who's clearly a visionary and a genius, pioneered e-commerce, and how could we have survived the pandemic without these incredible developments of technology, logistics? That's all great. I just think he has to pay taxes like everybody else. Like we can't live in a world where Jeff Bezos and Steve Schwarzman, who's a private equity magnate worth about $35 billion and who owns residences the way most of us own socks. We can't have these guys handing smaller slices of their income and wealth to the federal government than the people who are scrubbing the toilets in their multiple residences.
So if I were to, in a nutshell, describe what you're on a vendetta about, it's taxes.
No, it's more than taxes. It's antitrust enforcement. It's rules that allow labor to mobilize. I mean, it's about democracy being reasserted by the people who own it to have a say over the rules that govern the major economies in which we live, so that we don't just accept. I think that there is built into a lot of our journalism this false binary choice that Davos Man has very carefully insinuated into our discourse through compliant think tanks and star-loving access journalists and strategic communications firms. This idea that, like, if we monkey with the magic formula we've got now, then we might as well be Venezuela. Like if you ask, well, why can't Pfizer actually be forced to make their vaccines more available, or why can't we set aside intellectual property in the middle of a pandemic and make it possible for countries around the world to develop life-saving vaccines? Then you might as well be a Bolshevik. You might as well be arguing that we follow the North Korean development model. I mean, these things are absurd. I mean, we've lived through periods of American history where we've had much higher taxes, we've had antitrust enforcement, we've had much greater say by labor movements, and what we've had is much more equitable growth. We've had growth, we've had innovation. I don't have a fetish for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I don't want a time machine backwards. We made a lot of social progress that we want to hang on to, but we got to get back to a kind of capitalism, and we do need capitalism. I mean, let's make no mistake about that. But we need a kind of capitalism that is regulated, so it's not just monopoly power and corporate welfare schemes that have taken over our government through selective lobbying. We need competition and innovation, and we need the benefits of growth to flow to people who work for a living.
So, and yet, if you look at what's happening in our political system today in the United States, you have most Republicans who still want to see Donald Trump president. They still believe, maybe even more so than he does, in what he stood for. You have Republicans in the Senate who still block the kinds of, maybe even a few Democrats who still block some of the most far-reaching legislation that Joe Biden wants to do, the things that you're talking about, to not help the wealthy class, not Davos Man, but the little man. And so it's not necessarily a case of Davos Man manipulating the system. These are voters.
But
no, these are
you're
voters.
saying is a product of manipulating the system.
This is the voting base of the Republican Party.
Really?
That likes things the way they are.
Really? So you think that the status quo is a reflection of the popular will?
Well, I mean, people vote, right? They voted for Donald Trump, and
first
they
of
would
all,
vote for him again.
We have a systematic attack on voting rights in many battleground states. Secondly, I mean, we can see with our own eyes in the state of California, people favor single-payer healthcare. The governor campaigned on single-payer healthcare. We're talking like 70+% of people want single-payer healthcare. The health insurance lobby kicks into gear and they shut it down. I mean, the idea that we can somehow draw a line between Davos Man's machinations, which we can see with our own eyes. I mean, we can see that Amazon employs 100 lobbyists in Washington. Do we think it's coincidental that there are large numbers of people in the halls of Congress who are doing the bidding of Amazon, that's an expression of belief and popular will? We think that huge numbers of Americans have looked carefully into the question of paid sick leave for service sector workers and have concluded that they shouldn't get it. I mean, what we have is a political process that's been so warped and taken over by the donor class that it no longer expresses the popular will in many cases, to the degree to which it's even a democracy at all, given the attack on voting rights. So no, I mean, I look at what you're describing in terms of the inability to make the sorts of changes that much of the public really wants as a sign that Davos Man is strong and effective and is unleashing his apparatus in the interest of perpetuating the status quo. And that's why we ought to be very, very suspicious of stakeholder capitalism, because Davos Man understands that if we had an expression of popular will, things would change. There would be wealth taxes. There would be an expansion of public health care. There would be assistance for people who need it, paying for higher education. The infrastructure would be built out. All of this stuff would cost money, and it would have to come from Davos Man. So Davos Man goes to Davos and talks about, win-win solutions. Everything's a win-win solution, and then perpetuates this idea that, oh, we have all these divisions in Washington, as if he's somehow not involved in that. We gotta wake up to the reality that none of this stuff's happening by accident.
Okay, so another question from Bill Holstein. And he asked, to what extent is the problem the explosion of technology? And that has, created billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Have governments failed to manage the explosion of technology? Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the problem. But again, often not accidental. I mean, one of the stories I tell in my book, it's familiar to some, but not enough, is, for a long time, we were governed by real antitrust enforcement, going back to the time when the robber barons saw their giant monopolies broken up and into the New Deal. And then beginning in the late 70s, and then especially under Reagan in the States, we lifted antitrust enforcement in the name of efficiency and scale. And this didn't happen by accident. I mean, Robert Bork was a law professor at the University of Chicago, the hotbed of neoliberalism, who had this very far from the mainstream idea that any merger that didn't immediately result in higher prices for consumers, the government shouldn't be involved. We should just step aside and let it happen. And now we live in a time when very savvy tech companies like Google and Facebook most prominently are giving away their products for free to consumers. So if your focus is purely on what's the consumer paying, there's no harm to any of what they're doing. And this is why Lina Khan, who's this young incoming chair of the Federal Trade Commission, who famously wrote this Yale Law Review article about Amazon several years ago, is now seeking to reclaim traditional antitrust law and update it for the modern age from the Bork mentality that has dominated. Yeah, there's no question that the technologists have outrun the capacity of government, and business models have gotten more and more effective. But that's about very smart Davos men figuring out how to manipulate the system so they end up with more of the gains for capitalism. And that's what we've got to solve if we're going to have any hope of solving the really huge problems like climate change and the erosion of middle-class security.
Here's another question from John Kopish, one of our members. He asks, isn't our ever-growing government the real problem by implementing regulations and handing out tax breaks that always favor one group over another? If the government is going to distribute favors, then billionaires and other people are going to lobby for them. We know, based on the numbers, that when government meddles less in the economy, inequality tends to fall.
I'm not sure that I buy that last supposition at all. I mean, the period in which we had the most inclusive growth was 45 to 75, when the old cliche that a rising tide lifts all boats really did apply. And that was a time when we had tax rates pushing 90% for very, very high earners. We had much more robust social safety nets than we have now. We had aggressive intervention in antitrust so that we didn't have the monopoly power that, I mean, look, since the late 70s, actually, just look at one industry that I've written about recently, the meat packers. They have the 4 largest meat packers in America have increased their concentration of slaughterhouse capacity from 35% to 85%. That's what happened when the government stepped away and said, yeah, boys, go ahead, just buy one another. You'll get bigger, and supposedly we'll get, more efficient plants, and that'll turn into lower prices. It turned into lower costs for meat packers, but that actually turned into cattle ranchers going out of business because they're getting a much smaller slice of what we American consumers used to spend on beef. Moreover, at the other end, the 4 dominant packers can squeeze all the distribution channels, the restaurants, the supermarket chains, and force them to pay higher prices. So the net effect of this is we're paying higher as consumers. Cattle ranchers are going out of business, and 4 behemoth conglomerates that have been allowed to swallow one another by government stepping away are getting more and more of the gains, especially JBS, a Brazilian conglomerate that's led by a couple of convicted felons who fleeced banks at home and went on a buying spree that put them in control of lots of slaughterhouse operations in America. That's just one example. But, I would say that you cannot differentiate between government and Davos Man. Yes, it's true that this kind of arms race of tax cuts, one state versus one another, countries against one another, that's been debilitating. But it's a chicken and egg thing. I mean, government didn't just decide to hand out tax cuts to businesses. They did it because businesses lobbied them. And this is the whole point. Our democracy has been captured by a handful of very powerful interests that have taken an economy in the States. And again, my book's not just about the States. It's about Britain. It's about France. It's about Sweden. It's about Italy. Had taken economies that did succeed in delivering innovation and growth and giving people opportunities. And they have diverted most of the gain. They've dismantled public infrastructure and diverted the proceeds to themselves. And it's very easy to pick on government because government's now really weak. This is the Davos Man playbook. First, you make a cut, then government struggles, then you say, oh, government's so dysfunctional, we may as well just eliminate a whole agency and take the proceeds and give it to ourselves, and we'll give it back through philanthropy. That's what I call the cosmic lie in the book, and it is indeed a lie.
So I wanted to ask you about one of those countries, Sweden, which many of us in the States think of as kind of a role model of the social welfare state, although it's maybe less so now than it was in the 80s and 90s when they had their terrible financial crisis. But you use Sweden as an example of one Davos man, Steve Schwarzman, caused many of its problems, including a housing shortage and the rise of its right-wing Sweden Democrats Party. Explain that. How did Steve Schwarzman do all that?
I mean, he didn't. Let me be clear. Steve Schwarzman is not responsible for the rise of the Sweden Democrats any more than Steve Schwarzman is responsible for the failure of American healthcare in the face of the pandemic. But he's part of both of those stories, and he represents a class of investors who did play a significant role. So, Sweden is a country that indeed does have a lot that many countries could emulate. It has very generous parental leave. I mean, if a baby's born in Sweden, the parents get 500 days of leave to apportion however they like between them. This is why rates of women in the workforce in Sweden are world beating, because it's actually possible to be a working mother, and there's available childcare, and education is free for everyone, and everyone's got healthcare. I mean, these are real achievements. But in recent years, there has been a backlash to very high rates of tax required to pay for all these things. And Sweden has quietly dropped a lot of wealth taxes, cut a lot of revenue, and squared the books by cutting things like healthcare and especially care for senior services. And at the same time, there's been a lot of forays into real estate by people like Steve Schwarzman. And it may be a surprise to those of us who are in New York, but Stockholm is actually a less affordable city. It's harder to find an affordable apartment in Stockholm that is in that bastion of low-income housing, New York City. That's in part because of people like Steve Schwarzman, who are very savvy about finding places where they can go in, take control of huge blocks of housing, jack up the rent, cut maintenance. And so he's part of that story of people sort of losing faith in the elite at the same time that the Swedish state is catering more and more to people like Steve Schwarzman or to Ingvar Kamprad, who's kind of a bit player in my book, the founder of IKEA, who leaves to get out from under what he views as excessive rates of taxation. So Sweden drops the wealth taxes. And so fast forward to the pandemic, where Sweden effectively decides to euthanize senior citizens in the pandemic. Sweden has much higher rates of death than any of its Nordic neighbors. And I tell this story in some detail in the book. And if you're interested in the details, I encourage you to read the book. But basically, the people running the Swedish healthcare system understand that they've lost so much capacity that senior citizens in nursing homes in Stockholm, there's a city directive. If they have COVID symptoms, they may not even be examined by a physician. There is no diagnosis. There's no assessment. They're placed on a morphine drip, and they're certainly not taken to a hospital because hospital capacity must be saved for people who actually can be saved, younger people. And that is a direct consequence of Sweden catering its policies to the investor class by dropping tax rates. We've seen a straight up reduction in care for seniors and healthcare in general.
And yet, to go back to Steve Schwarzman, he was really only invested in that company that was the real estate investor company for like 3 years.
Right.
Yeah, and it was a small company. It was really not a big investment.
It was a pretty big investment. I think he ultimately flipped the whole portfolio for several $1 billion. Again, Stephen Schwarzman doesn't have to apologize for the rise of the Sweden Democrats, but Stephen Schwarzman is emblematic. The fact that you could find an investor like Stephen Schwarzman, even in Sweden, this supposed bastion of social democracy, and suddenly have large numbers of working people discover that their rents are going up, they can't reach anybody to fix their plumbing or electrical problems, and then they wake up to discover that their apartments that they've been living in for decades are just chips on the board for an American private equity magnate who thinks globally. That's a shock to the system. And it's part of an erosion of faith in the elites that goes together with inequality that contributes to the situation that we're in now, where large numbers of people are willing to embrace cockamamie explanations and damaging policy prescriptions as a response to their very real problems. Huge numbers of people around the world, including in Sweden, through their lived experience, have come to conclude that their ability to support themselves at a middle-class standard just doesn't matter very much to the people who are running their systems. And that's partially the result of inequality. And that is what has opened the door to outfits like the Sweden Democrats, who come along and point to immigrants and say, well, this is why you can't get an appointment to see the dentist anymore. This is why your relative can't get a bed in a senior home. It's because of these, Afghan immigrants who, it's a nonsensical economic explanation, but it's a very satisfying political explanation in a largely homogeneous society where people are already just uncomfortable that they're living next to a mosque.
Patty Kranz says, but Davos Man does not rule everything. Why don't more voters support unions? Why don't more people vote for higher taxes for billionaires?
Well, in many cases, people do vote for people who support higher taxes for billionaires, but Davos Man is especially skilled at fear mongering and at, again, giving us this false binary. I mean, this is a project now that's many, many years old. I mean, it goes back to in the States to the Reagan Revolution, right? And I mean, Reagan takes office at a time when wages are already declining for working people, and it's very satisfying to embrace somebody who's promising to cut your taxes, and he demonizes government. And huge numbers of think tanks then participate in the demonizing of government, underwritten by corporate interests that benefit from less regulation, and their executives benefit from lower taxation. And this has actually saturated our thinking. I mean, we're confused about the nature of our problems. I mean, look, how is Trump able to take office blaming China for the demise of American middle-class security? Now, China is a subject we could talk about, for its own separate hour. China is a real threat to the global trading system. It's a serious challenge. It's a complex story. But the idea that, huge numbers of Americans, I mean, some, but not huge numbers of Americans, have seen their living standards, decimated by China is just absurd. It's a diversion. I mean, huge numbers of Americans have seen their living standards decimated by decisions made in corporate boardrooms in Seattle, where Bezos is indeed part of a downgrading of wages for huge numbers of service workers, following on Walmart, a company he actually tried to emulate. Decisions made in boardrooms in New York, decisions made in the halls of Congress and in successive presidential administrations. I mean, the idea that we're going to pin it all on China is absurd, and yet that works. And so Davos Man is very skilled at serving up his own interests as all of our interests. I mean, look, the World Economic Forum, which is an institution that I actually dig into in the book, this is an entity that operates under the banner committed to improving the state of the world. This extraordinary claim for an entity that is dominated by a group that, by any reasonable measure, they stand as the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo. Mark Benioff, who's on the board of the World Economic Forum, actually said out loud on a panel discussion last year at virtual Davos, he said, CEOs are the real heroes of the pandemic. Not frontline medical workers, not the people delivering our food, not parents stuck in home. But it's not a gaffe, though. It's a worldview. I mean, it's not a gaffe because he underscored it. He said, and we did it not for profit, but to save the world. He went on to say, government didn't save you, non-governmental organizations didn't save you, we saved you. I mean, this is consistent with this view that you can count on us to look after your interests. And we've been living through half a century of that kind of thinking, and it hasn't worked out very well. So the fact that people still believe it is a sign of how powerful these notions are.
So Patty's question leads me to my question, and Bill Holstein has the same question, is, so what do we do? What are some of your solutions to the Davos Man effect?
Well, the big stuff, very simple to describe and very difficult to execute, right? Like, we don't need a revolution. We don't need to get rid of capitalism. We don't need to confiscate the wealth of the Davos Man. We need to get back to what we already had. We need progressive taxation, which will not only provide government with the resources to deliver things that people actually want, like healthcare and affordable education and infrastructure that isn't an embarrassment, but will also restore a sense of basic fairness. We need collective bargaining, so workers, not through unilateral magnanimous gestures like stakeholder capitalism, can actually mobilize to get their piece of the pie. And we need antitrust enforcement so that small businesses can expand, so that larger businesses can operate on a truly level playing field. But to do that, we need to get money out of politics. And these things are very hard. I mean, Davos Man is not going to just surrender. Davos Man is going to trot out new things like stakeholder capitalism, aimed at demonstrating that he'll take care of this while deflecting attention and releasing pressure to actually deliver. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, I explore the Preston model from the city of Preston in the northwest of England, where after 10 years of very brutal austerity, the leaders of local communities got together and they agreed that, well, they would at least take their procurement, when they spend to build a new police station, or they hire a company to bring in the meals at the local school district, they would have a bias toward local companies.
Yeah.
So that would at least create more local jobs. It would keep wealth in communities. Excuse me. I mean, that's one sort of middle step. And then, we're living in a time when, thanks to the pandemic, where we no longer have the sticker shock on enormous government expenditures that make something like universal basic income, which is an idea that I have sort of mixed feelings about, but that I explore in the book, that once seemed like a total fantasy, like, the government might just as well commit to handing out a unicorn to every American. Well, now, people like Nancy Pelosi have said, maybe it's time to do this. We've had a form of universal basic income through Biden's tax credits that now for families with children that now are not, going to be continued. So, these are some sort of middle step that we can take, but really we need to get back to what we already had. And that, again, labor, strengthening of labor, antitrust enforcement, and progressive taxation.
I think progressive taxation and a basic income are like, speaking of unicorns, it's just is very hard to get through our political system. And I'm not sure it's the fault of Davos Man. I mean,
but who's financing the campaigns of the people who are in the government deciding what is and isn't politically reasonable? I mean, this idea that somehow Davos Man can be separated from the government, I frankly just don't understand it. I mean, who is financing campaigns, think tanks? Who's hiring the lobbyists? I mean, do we think that all the stuff that we've experienced is just happening by accident? I just don't understand that idea. I mean, the sort of sophisticated shrug idea is that, globalization is so much bigger than any given nation, and automation is more important than trade, and technology is a force that's beyond control. So, it's futile to try to change anything. We just have to understand this, like we're describing the weather system. Well, that's a kind of sophisticated way to do Davos Man's bidding, though it doesn't actually withstand scrutiny. But this idea that somehow, well, it's the government's fault and the government reflects the popular will of the people, and never mind all the money that's flowing into campaigns and the lobby shops that are developing our policies. Like, I just don't understand that argument.
Well, I guess I'm just being a devil's advocate here. What I'm trying to say is that there are other points of view, if the government does any more spending than it has, it's going to add to our inflation problem. Or there's a point of view. I mean, there are people with ideologies that they just don't want more government. There are people who don't want progressive taxation. They don't want, higher taxes at all. They just don't believe in raising.
Well, wait, but you're conflating two things that are separate. I mean, you can't say that you're worried about the deficit and then progressive taxation is going to give us more government, as if these are part of the same thing. Like, why is it that we always seem to have enough money to finance additional defense spending and tax cuts for billionaires, but the idea that we could have national health care in America, well, that's pie in the sky. That's insane. This thing that every other developed democracy seems to manage to finance. Well, what's the difference between the United States and every other developed democracy? It's the inability to tax wealthy people. And why is it so hard to tax wealthy people in America? Because wealthy people control our government. I mean, it's sitting right out there in plain view for all of us to see. So I just push back on this idea that, these are just reasonable policy disagreements and different sets of beliefs. I mean, many of our beliefs that turn into, it's just politically impossible to deliver on any of the things that huge numbers of people actually want, according to every conceivable poll, that is directly a reflection of the fact that we've internalized Davos Man's narrative, this idea that, if you try to force Pfizer to think about vaccine equality around the globe, well, then we're not going to get any medical innovation. Like, look, we heard this on, setting aside intellectual property on HIV drugs. in the 80s and 90s, in the 90s, and that was pure nonsense. We've had lots of innovation, and we've got lots of billionaire pharmaceutical executives. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having lots of wealthy people capitalize on their ideas and do better than everybody else. That's part and parcel of the American system. There is something wrong with huge numbers of people feeling so ostracized from their economy that they glom onto insane conspiracy theories that prevent them from taking vaccines in a pandemic, and they mount an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. And these things are connected. We cannot survive as a democratic society with so many people being simply outside of the basic economy that we're living in.
We only have a few more minutes, but I do want to ask you, when you say things like, referring to Davos Man, they feasted on calamity, that COVID's lethal impacts and economic ravages were magnified by their actions, that they are predators who attack without restraint. They've managed to turn every crisis into an opportunity for their further enrichment. When you write things like that, do you feel that you're really showing your hand here, you're not holding back much. Can you still be an objective reporter for the New York Times?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't buy the idea that being an objective reporter for the New York Times means I can't take 30 years of reporting experience and transparently help the reader with the conclusion. I mean, I am open-minded. I work for no political party. I work for no particular corporate interest, but I've been writing about the economy now for a long time. And I've watched and tested a lot of ideas, and I do have a point of view. But that doesn't mean that I can't continue to think critically and test out the limitations of my own thinking. I mean, this book represents stuff I've been thinking about for a long time, and that thinking is not over. I mean, I'm not at the end.
Have you heard from any of your Davos men? Have they gotten back to you? Have you gotten feedback? What do they think?
Well, most of these guys that I've written about, I mean, I've had contact with them over the years. I've seen them up close in various forums, but most of them didn't engage on the book to begin with. Benioff did, to his credit. I had a long conversation and a bunch of text exchanges with Benioff, though when I finally had to check a fact in my excerpt, he had tweeted out a picture of himself on a boat with Lars Ulrich, the Metallica drummer, that I used at the end of an excerpt to make the point that it was kind of comical that Benioff keeps saying that the virus has unified us all. We're just one big family. It's erased the illusions of our borders. By the way, somebody reached out to tell me that Salesforce actually does business with ICE, an entity for which our borders are in no way illusory. He didn't respond to my question, is that really Lars Ulrich in the boat next to you? The World Economic Forum communications people wrote a blog post about my book where they actually praised it for its description of inequality, but they said, we wish you hadn't made us part of the problem. Other than that, I can't say I've had a lot of
mild rebuke
contact from Davos Man.
So you don't worry that if you try to write about JP Morgan or Salesforce or Amazon or Blackstone that you won't be able to get access?
I'm not an access journalist. I mean, my feeling is that those who think strategically about access are generally participating in kind of PR apparatus. I mean, this is how I've operated my whole career. Like I ask questions and people get back to me or they don't. I welcome access on transparent terms, and I'd love to spend time talking to corporate CEOs, but I'm not going to pull my punches and underserve the reader with clarity because I'm worried about whether Jamie Dimon will shake my hand at a cocktail party if I go back to Davos. I mean, I think that's a form of corruption that doesn't serve anybody's interests.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Peter. This was wonderful, very, very enlightening. keep on breaking dishes and tilting at windmills and being an iconoclast. Your book is available on Amazon.com,
It is.
but also
Yeah,
at small bookstores near you.
that's true.
Thank you.
Thanks for your spirited questions, Paula. And thanks,
Okay.
Patty, for arranging this. And thanks to everybody at OPC. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night. Thank you for joining us, participants.